A chilly gust swept in from the sea and over the infantry column, sending locks of Lugo Agrella's hair over his face. He brushed them aside with his fingers, focusing his gaze on the coast. Road conditions remained poor since the storm, and a ceiling of dark clouds made improvements to travel conditions a dubious prospect, at best. "Slow our pace by a half measure," he ordered. "Make sure the sergeants keep their men on the road." The man riding to his right, a knight of House Agrella by the name of Ibarra, nodded. "Understood, Lord Lugo." Lugo looked over his shoulder at the column stretching halfway to the horizon. Not long ago, the idea he would be leading so many men at arms would have filled him with a sense of chivalric pride, but now his mind was filled with other concerns. They were lucky they hadn't brought any wagons, as the men halfway down the column were already ankle-deep in mud. If they tried to make things easier on themselves by walking off to the side of the road, the local tenants would press charges for damaging their property. Transporting troops was normally done with ships in the Holy Kingdom, and he didn't envy Riastais and Baharuth for being stuck with the headaches of land-bound logistics every day. Gomez, one of the ranchers screening ahead, stopped his mount and waited for the column to catch up. When they did, he nudged his mount into a walk beside Lugo's. "Someone's up ahead. Dressed in city clothes." "Another one?" Lugo peered up the road. Several minutes later, a silhouette appeared. It froze for a moment before fleeing into the field. Unbelievable, he shook his head. They had only traveled for a few hours, yet had come across dozens of men and women fleeing the conscription order from Hobans. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't wrap his head around how shamelessly immoral some people could be. "If you were called to serve," Lugo asked Gomez, "what would you do?" "I'd go," the rancher answered. "I admit I'd be annoyed, though." "In what way?" I suppose the way the army does things doesn't sit right with me." The unexpected answer gave Lugo pause. He was half expecting something about unfairness or inconvenience. "What do you mean by that?" Nothing about you nobles." "Well, maybe. The army does things the way they do, and it ain't how we ranchers do things. Any commoner who ends up in the army is handed a spear and told to hold the line. They could be using people like us as cavalry, but that's not something for the rank and file." "I understand where you're coming from," Lugo said, "but there are more substantial reasons. The Royal Army can't afford that many horses." Even before the war, manning the wall to 20% of its design capacity was a monumental struggle for the Holy Kingdom. Men were much cheaper to sustain than horses. "You get what you pay for," Gomez shrugged. "As for whether it's worth it, well, we'll just have to see about that shortly." The rancher urged his mount into a canter, returning to his position ahead of the column. Lugo frowned at his back as he rode off, silently digesting the dark tone of the man's voice. As far as he knew, the attitudes harbored by Miss Baratha and her followers were never before noted in the entire history of the Holy Kingdom. Then again, never before had the Holy Kingdom been in its present situation. As far as the conservative camp went, their position was still broadly one of firm, but peaceful, political opposition. Baratha must have realized that when she told him what she did before departing for Lloyd's. And, if it becomes a civil conflict, then what? His faction was prepared to show their resolve, but it was a last resort option. Too late, he realized that Baratha's people had already reached the point where they considered the last resort their sole remaining recourse. If a new choice presented itself, would they even recognize it? Or would it be seen as a stalling tactic, perhaps deception from the royalists? Lugo understood that his more traditional peers in the conservative camp would see any violence as a violation of diplomatic convention. This left him in an unenviable position as the Duke's representative in the prefecture. Lugo looked over his shoulder once again. He had 3 companies of men-at-arms while Baratha had 1. However, that would quickly change when Baratha's reinforcements arrived. Lugo had no practical way to stop her if she decided to attack the royalists, so he could only pray that cooler heads prevailed in the trial ahead. The hours passed as they rode into dusk. Villagers in the settlements along the way looked curiously from their homes, and many children came out to gape at them as they passed. As twilight was replaced by the light of the waxing moon, an elderly man from the fishing village ahead came out to meet him on the road. "Is this the village of North Point?" Lugo asked from atop his horse. "It is," the elder said in a voice that was as wiry as he looked. "Miss Baratha stopped by on her way to Lloyd's," said someone named Lugo, Guerrero, and Carlos were going to arrive tonight. Lord Lugo of Agrella. Lugo introduced himself, then gestured to his left. This is Captain Guerrero. Captain Carlos and his men haven't caught up with us yet, but they shouldn't be long in coming. I see, the elder nodded. Pedro, chief of North Point. The westernmost one. Lugo smiled slightly at the chief's response. There were, in fact, 5 villages named North Point in the Holy Kingdom, 3 on the northern coast and 2 others on the south side of the Central Bay. Miss Baraja said that Lord Aston's approved of your stay here. Chief Pedro turned around to gaze at the coast. We have plenty of free space on the beach, so feel free to make yourselves at home, Lord Lugo. Excellent, Lugo nodded. Do you have stores of firewood we could purchase for tonight? If you don't mind burning damp fuel, plenty of driftwood's washed up on the beach after that storm. You're free to take as much of that as you'd like. The crabs, too. Did you say crabs? Lugo frowned. Crabs, Lord Lugo, the chief nodded. With that, the old man turned around and tottered away. Lugo exchanged looks with the men nearby. Any idea what he meant by that? Only one way to find out. Gomez urged his mount into a trot. Lugo led the column around the perimeter of the village, catching up to the rancher 5 minutes later. He looked down from the sandy escarpment in shock. A lot of crabs, eh? Gomez said. That's just a bit of an understatement. The storm had washed up a wall of driftwood, which was teeming with countless crabs. Most were regular-sized, but several dozen were between 1 meter to 2 meters across. We can't camp with those here, Lugo said. The village itself is at risk of being destroyed. Destroyed by crabs, Gomez said flatly. Lord Lugo isn't wrong, Captain Guerrero told him. The gyre brings all sorts of nasties to the north coast. A village is lost to crabs out here at least once a year. Fortunately, the crabs don't move on to the nearby villages until they run out of food on the beach, so the locals have plenty of time to get out of the way if adventurers don't show up. Gomez's expression told Lugo that he didn't believe the captain's claim in the slightest. What's so damn special about these crabs? The rancher asked. Actually, you know what, how much is clearing up these walking meals worth as an adventurer commission? Come to think of it, Captain Guerrero said, I recall something about being paid. Gomez and Captain Guerrero sent expectant looks in Lugo's direction. Lugo spent a moment recalling his house's commission tables. An infestation of giant crabs, one of this magnitude would open as a gold rank commission. Considering the distance to Lloyd's and the time required to eliminate every threat, a meter-wide giant crab would be worth 1 silver. 2-meter crabs would be worth 3. Isn't that too cheap for something that needs a gold-ranked team to beat? Captain Guerrero asked. Individually, Lugo answered, a giant crab can be safely dispatched by an iron-ranked team. Work like this is slated for gold because the sheer number of crabs can easily overwhelm anything less than a gold-ranked team. As for the low rates, adventurers keep the materials gained from commissions unless specified otherwise. I see. Captain Guerrero turned to address his company. You heard the young lord here. His voice boomed into the moonlit night. We're getting paid to eat. Spears and shields, 3 deep. Gomez, you're on offense. Even as the captain gave his orders, his company rushed to comply. They formed a small shield wall 3 men deep on the beach below while Gomez's 2 squads of light cavalry rode ahead. Lugo, accompanied by Sir Ibarra, trotted their mounts down to join Captain Guerrero behind his company. What's the plan, here? Lugo asked. It's simple, Lord Lugo, Captain Guerrero replied. The shield wall is the fort. Gomez's men are the raiders. The raiders retreat to the fort if they bite off more than they can chew. Are you certain things will go as you expect? They're just crabs, the captain shrugged. Actually, it may not. Ranchers are great at dealing with beasts, so Gomez's men may wipe out the colony without us. 4 crabs already lay motionless on the sand, their bony shells no match for the ranchers' iron quarrels. Those that attempted to pursue the raiders in retaliation looked like they had no hope of getting close. 2 kills later, Gomez charged the shield wall, a 2-meter-wide crab scuttling after him. He performed a sharp turn, twisting around in his saddle to call out to them as he rode off. I hope you boys like Shireen, 'cause that's the only meal you get. Lugo gripped the hilt of his longsword as the giant crab, which must have weighed at least 100 kilograms, smashed into the shield wall. Still, the company held firm. Shouts arose as spears stabbed at the stunned crustacean. Lugo sat aghast at the reckless stunt, but Captain Guerrero only grinned. Company, advance. Captain Guerrero's company moved forward, their suits of scale mail glistening in the silver light. By the time they arrived at the driftwood wall, over a dozen giant crabs already lay slain while a dozen more chased the mounted crossbowmen around the beach. Captain Guerrero hefted a spear and hurled it at a group of unengaged crabs foraging through the debris, skewering one of them. The others went into their odd, sideways scuttle, charging the infantry line. Brace! The captain commanded. Unlike the first giant crab, the next group bounced off of the shield wall. Spears flashed to take advantage of the openings, though the largest crab quickly recovered. It slashed at the barrier several times with its oversized claws before opting to climb over it. A sergeant and 2 of his men reacted immediately. Thrust. 3 spears lanced in from the back of the formation, punching into the giant crab's underside and knocking it off of the shield wall. It lay upside down, twitching as froth bubbled out of the holes in its shell. They know martial arts. The ranchers seemed competent enough, but the men of Captain Carlo's company were even more so. Could every single one use them? Only 1% of the Royal Army had been capable of such feats, so where did these men appear from, if so? His questions aside, the Royalists in Lloyd's had little chance in combat against them without an overwhelming numbers advantage. By all reports, their retinues in the north were made up of hastily assembled groups of spares with a few experienced officers leading them. Mama crabs come out. A set of ranchers crossed in front of the shield wall. On their tails was a monstrous crab that seemed to have come out of nowhere. Captain Guerrero grabbed another spear and sprinted around the left of the shield wall while the formation maneuvered to face the towering threat. Fortress. The captain's spear blocked a claw twice his size. As he grappled with the huge crustacean, his men advanced from the flank. Their shields formed a protective roof over their heads as they attacked their foes' legs, and black bolts rained in from the ranchers surrounding monstrous crab, though they bounced off of its sturdy shell more often than they penetrated. Clods of sand flew every which way as the massive beast tried to react to its assailants, but the conclusion was all but foregone. A few minutes later, it collapsed to the ground and the men drew back, lowering their shields to look up at their fallen foe. Lord Lugo, Captain Guerrero propped his spear on the sand. How much would you say that one was worth? By the time Captain Carlos arrived with his reinforcements, the feast was already in full swing. The men in the camp were at a loss as to what to do, so they recruited some fishwives from the village to help out. A huge fire was built and the monstrous crab's 5-meter-wide shell was placed atop it, serving as a giant pot. Troops and villagers both were gathered on the beach, partaking in the delicious bounty. We rushed over expecting a fight, Captain Carlos said, not a feast. Well, we got both. Captain Guerrero didn't look up from the giant crab leg lying across his lap. Lugo shook his head, eyeing the monstrous crab-turned cookpot. Alone, the huge creature was at least a high gold rank commission, roughly equivalent in difficulty rating to a single hill giant. The Royalists probably had about as much of a chance against Captain Guerrero and his company as they did against the average demi-human warband. Once he ate his fill, Lugo looked around for the village chief, finding him in one of the groups around the cook fire. Chief Pedro, he said, is there some place nearby where we can gain a vantage on Lloyd's? The elderly man gestured to the rocky formation jutting out at the eastern end of the cove. You can see the entire city from the end of the cape, the elderly man told him. Lugo thanked the chief before searching for Captain Carlos and Captain Guerrero. Sir Ibarra joined them with a small escort and they scaled the point to gaze upon the city in the distance. The moon was bright enough to distinguish most of the countryside between themselves and Lloyd's. Lugo examined the surroundings through a spyglass as Baraja's officers discussed their options. If it doesn't rain on our asses, Captain Guerrero said, we should arrive at Lloyd's before noon. You sure you want to camp here overnight? Captain Carlos asked. The sentries on the city wall will notice us long before we get to the Londine. It was a valid point, and one Lugo had discussed with Captain Guerrero while their troops prepared for their march back in Bast. In the end, however, they decided it was better to arrive well rested. It's better to be relatively fresh than exhausted just as our opponents are waking up, Lugo said. I don't believe the Royalists have a chance either way, so we may as well keep morale up. How does the landing spot look? Lord Lugo? Captain Guerrero asked. Lugo adjusted his spyglass, focusing on the stretch of beach between the city walls and the village to the east of it. Most of the northern coast had been pounded into sand by the relentless, gyre-driven waves, so the location was more of a loose area they had picked out that was far enough from the city to strip the royalists of any defensive advantage. It's littered with debris from the storm, much like the beach here. Any crabs? Not that I can see. We can. Hold up, Captain Carlos said. I think we should get moving, after all. Lugo lowered his spyglass, turning a frown on the rancher. Then, he followed the line of the man's gaze to a set of sails billowing in the moonlight. You sure it's not ours? Captain Guerrero asked. Either way, Captain Carlos said, we're supposed to secure the Londine, yeah? Lugo raised his spyglass again. The next galleon to Bast was due to arrive early in the morning, so reinforcements from Rimian showing up early wasn't outside the realm of expectation. His field of view traveled to the ship's stern, where the ensign of the Holy Kingdom fluttered in the wind. He cursed upon seeing what accompanied it. A band of vines with white flowers, Lugo said. How sorta? It's a royalist ship. There's no way they ain't noticed our little beach party, Captain Carlos said. Wait, another ship's coming up behind it. Lugo scanned the horizon with his spyglass until he found the next vessel. I can't make out the pennant, he muttered. Yellow crescent moon, Captain Carlos said. Or maybe the sun sinking into the sea? Colors? White on top, blue on the bottom. Another royalist ship, Lugo said, but that house was assigned to a county in Kalincha Prefecture. It may be a supply ship heading past Lloyd's. All right, Captain Carlos said, then what about the next one? With a deepening frown, Lugo shifted his spyglass until he found another galleon. Behind that one, another set of sails was coming over the horizon. I think we should go, Captain Guerrero said. I think so, too. Lugo collapsed his spyglass. The third galleon was sailing past North Point by the time they broke camp. Lugo clenched his reins impatiently as they set a brisk, but measured pace for their march. Why is there a royalist fleet here? Captain Carlos asked. Did they respond that quickly to us being here? That's highly doubtful, Lugo answered. Even if they were informed of our arrival in Bast, it's difficult to believe that they could muster a suitable response and deliver it to Lloyd's in less than a week. Unless they knew something was going on before that. Information from Rimian, for instance. It could even be a response to Los Ganaderos going over to the Duke's side. There were any number of incidents that could have spurred the royalists to action. He couldn't say that there was any real secrecy to what they were doing, either, as merchants still flowed freely throughout the Holy Kingdom. As reprehensible as their methods were, there were few fools amongst the royalists and none of them were in a position of any importance. An army could have been prepared in advance and dispatched as soon as they knew where to send them. Not to throw cold water on your excitement, Sir Jome said, but it may simply be a coincidence. Ships travel together for safety all the time, and the royalists have a greater distance to sail. Did Lord Aston say anything about the royalists' logistics? Captain Carlos asked. Honestly, Lugo answered, I didn't think to ask. Large, seafaring vessels are so scarce nowadays that one wouldn't expect fleets of them to appear. All the more reason to travel together, Sir Jome said. Losing even one to a monster would be a blow that they won't recover from any time soon. They may also have separately put into port to wait out the other day's storm, then departed together. It seemed that the ships could have shown up as they had for any number of reasons. Lugo turned his spyglass to the coast, where a fifth ship was overtaking the column. He scanned the length of the vessel, searching for any indication of its cargo. They're sitting too high on the water to be fully loaded with anything normally shipped to the north, he said. So, men? Men and their provisions, if it is. They may be loaded with conscripts bound for the wall, Sir Jome offered. No one's silly enough to send troops overland unless they're in Kalincha Prefecture. Lugo nodded. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation. His frown didn't leave him, however, as yet another disturbing possibility came to mind. What if the conscription order was drawn up to put down the conservative faction? Huh? The officers traveling alongside him all turned their dumbfounded gazes upon him. When I first heard about it in Bast, Lugo said, I thought the royalists were spiting us by not relaying the Holy King's edict. What if the true reason was that they were going to be deployed against us? If that was the case, then the royalists were so many moves ahead of the conservatives that their efforts seemed hopeless. But we haven't done anything wrong, Lord Lugo, Sir Abara said. Why would the crown? The crown has been anything but rational as of late, if you haven't noticed, Sir Abara. But there must be a motive, the knight said, however irrational it may be. We can spend all day making guesses and it wouldn't matter, Lugo said. It could be as simple, and insane, as our continued push for more reasonable domestic policies being judged as treason. The last set of sails disappeared over the horizon before the column had made it 3 kilometers out from North Point. Fears filled Lugo's mind as they marched on in silence. Bast could have been invaded while its defenders were away. Or ships could be lying in ambush for Baraha's reinforcements. A few hours later, Lugo cursed to himself as Lloyd's came into view, revealing all 5 galleons in the harbour. 3 were moored and disgorging men while the other 2 were anchored offshore as they awaited their turn in port. Well, Captain Guerrero said, that narrows things down immensely. The question now is who they're offloading, Lugo said. I know what you said about fighting southern retinues, but what will you do if faced with conscripts? The 2 captains shared a long look. That's a question for Miss Baraha to answer, Captain Guerrero said. But if I understand our plan correctly, wouldn't the army being here mean that the paladins can use them to help investigate the royalists? If they're here explicitly for us, Lugo said, that muddies the issue. The royalists will impede the Holy Order's procedures with claims of conspiracy and such, using the Royal Army's orders as proof. And what can we do about that? Nothing when we're 5 kilometers outside the city. Those damn royalists are probably pressing their case right at this very moment to preempt any of our attempts to sway the Holy Order. Miss Baraha came in ahead of them, Carlos said, so things may not be as grim as you think. That part worried him more than anything else. War hero or not, she would only be a lone woman against a small army. If they captured Baraha and held her hostage, there was a strong chance that her people would probably stand down. If she was imprisoned, it could kill the momentum of her following's campaign. Looks like they're forming up, Captain Carlos said. Lugo peered through the darkness before raising his spyglass again. How in the gods' names could the rancher see so far? What do you see, Lord Lugo? Sir Abara asked. Royal Army banners, Lugo sighed. Men streamed out of the city's western gate, forming up below the walls. Several hundred of them already formed neat ranks, yet there was no end in sight to the troops coming to bolster their lines. We must assume that every galleon was loaded with soldiers, Lugo said. I don't see much in the way of cavalry on their side. 5 southern galleons can transport somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 men, plus the forces that were already stationed in Lloyd's before their arrival. Then what's the plan? Captain Carlos asked. I don't fancy entertaining them where they are, Lugo said. We don't have to, Captain Guerrero told them. They haven't realized where we're headed yet. Lugo's eyes went from the city to the shore. The captain was right. Their goal wasn't to reach Lloyd's but to secure the beach 2 kilometers west of it. The royalists were positioning themselves directly beneath the city walls, oblivious to their opponent's objective. How shall we approach this? Lugo mused. They're protecting the gate because we're using the road. If they see us diverting to the coast, they'll figure out what we're up to. This battle is ours to take, Sir Abara said. And nothing says we must take it at all. He has a point, Captain Guerrero admitted. We don't have to be where we need to be until we need to be there. Sitting on the beach waiting for our reinforcements will give the royalists the high ground to set up on as they please, though we could. They're moving. Captain Carlos called out. Below the city walls, thousands of spearheads glinted in the moonlight as the royalist ranks advanced. But their troops are still coming out of the gate. Lugo furrowed his brow. Our reinforcements are here, Captain Guerrero said. Lugo looked north, scanning the horizon for a new set of sails, but he saw none. I don't see shit. The curse left his mouth as his eyes rested upon the cape behind them. An observer at Lloyd's would spot any vessels rounding the craggy point before they did. Let's move, Lugo said. What about the fields? Sir Abara asked. Lugo pointed ahead of them. We'll use the road over there. I hope the Allies don't mistake the royalists for their beachhead. I'd be more worried if they mistook us for the Royalists, Captain Guerrero laughed. Within minutes, the sails of another galleon appeared from behind the cape. Lugo raised his spyglass, focusing on the bow of the vessel. "It's the Dancing Duchess," he said. "Our reinforcements." They picked up their pace, but it still didn't seem fast enough. His studies never covered this part. Be they gripping epics or sterile histories, the tales of old never recounted the spaces between moments in history. Time seemed to crawl by as they raced for the beach, and they seemed to gain no ground on their opposition no matter how he willed it. "We're not going to make it in time." Carlos did offer to ride ahead and tie them up. There was a reason for Lugo to refuse that offer, though he wouldn't give voice to it. Simply put, the ranchers were already at the point where they were willing to visit violence upon the Royalists, and they didn't seem to appreciate the fact that their actions would affect the entire conservative faction. If the Royalists bled here, then the entire Holy Kingdom would bleed next. "The only way to tie up that many soldiers is with the threat of physical force," Lugo said. "Our plan to leverage the authority of the Holy Order won't work if fighting breaks out. Besides, Miss Baraja is on the wrong side of that army. We should confirm her safety before taking any actions that may put her at risk." That the Holy Order hadn't come out was a bad sign. He couldn't imagine them not noticing so many soldiers making their way through the city. Baraja should have had plenty of time to make her case before their arrival. A few hundred meters from the coast, the Dancing Duchess was already anchored, but she hadn't yet lowered any boats to send their reinforcements ashore. The Royalist forces were advancing steadily up the beach, making better time than Lugo's column, which was still struggling through the mud a kilometer from the sea. Technically, Lugo's forces commanded a superior position. The Royalists had given up the high ground in favor of preventing any landings. Additionally, fighting with one's back to the sea might have been desirable for merfolk, but not humans. Unfortunately, the tactical situation was more akin to a war game than a war. The probing raids and skirmishes that a commander relied upon to discern an enemy's strength were not an option when hostilities hadn't been declared. Thus, the reasonable assumption would be that every unit on the field was of relatively uniform quality. If he were in the Royalist commander's shoes, he would have decided that the conservative forces were desperate, delusional, or bluffing in the face of 7-1 odds. "We can still win," Captain Guerrero said. "I don't doubt that we can," Lugo said, "especially if those are just freshly conscripted reservists cobbled together into new companies. The problem is that, win or lose, engaging in hostilities carries a high risk of civil war. We are in no way ready for an open conflict, and people across the country will suffer from the chaos that ensues." The captain seemed to have no answer to that. As excellent as he might be on the battlefield, he was uneducated and inexperienced in more far-reaching matters. "We don't have many options," Lugo admitted, "and none of them are ideal. In the Royalists' eyes, we are at a massive disadvantage, and that perception can only be overturned if we demonstrate our prowess. Of course, doing that will start a civil conflict. The Dancing Duchess doesn't look like she's trying to land her forces, so we can assume an advantageous position while we wait for Miss Baraja to show up. I can use the opportunity to fish some information out of our opponents." "How?" "By speaking with them," Lugo replied. "They won't attack anyone bearing a flag of parley." "What about calling them out for a martial contest?" Captain Carlos asked. Lugo shook his head. "The Royal Army isn't bound by chivalric traditions, but they'll talk to us to deliver an ultimatum, at least." After the two captains reluctantly agreed to his proposal, they positioned their forces above the beach where the Royalists were guarding the shore. Sir Ibarra and Captain Carlos accompanied him as he rode to a spot 200 meters from the Royal Army's lines. 15 minutes passed before a set of riders rode out to meet him. "Alana Orta," he said in a low voice as the riders approached, +2 knights. "That guy any good?" Captain Carlos asked. "I don't believe he distinguished himself while he served in the army," Lugo replied. "Nor does he have any other notable martial achievements. He was probably dispatched to Lloyd's as an administrator back when it changed hands." "Then what the hell is he doing out here? Does that mean they have a joke of a commander?" "He's probably coming out as a negotiator," Lugo replied. "That allows them to hide who their commander is, so we can't plan according to what we know of him." The banner of the Holy Kingdom waved in the ocean breeze as Lord Ilano and his party closed the distance. Normally, such an image would command the attention and respect of all who saw it. Now, however, Lugo could only think that the flag of his kingdom was being sullied. Lord Lugo, the somewhat effeminate man eased his mount to a halt opposite him. Fancy meeting you here. My thoughts precisely, Lord Ilano, Lugo replied. For what reason have you and the gentleman over there come to greet us? You and your forces are to stand down and submit themselves to justice. Screw that, Captain Carlos spat. We already know what your justice looks like. Lord Ilano's eyelid twitched at the coarse interruption, but he didn't shift his gaze. Let's be reasonable, Lord Lugo. We won't allow your friends offshore to land, and your 3 companies cannot hope to win against 5,000. There is no dishonor in sparing the lives of your men in the face of such impossible odds. On what grounds do you impede us? Lugo asked. We don't answer to house order. For that matter, what right do you have to field the royal army against us? Shouldn't it be obvious? Humor me. Better yet, let's hear it straight from your commander. The waves washed over the shore as they patiently awaited Lord Ilano's response. He looked over his shoulder once before visibly firming up. This is not a negotiation, Lord Lugo. I've said what I came to say. You are free to make your choice, but I pray that you won't force your men to a senseless death. Lord Ilano wheeled his mount and galloped back to the Royal Army's lines. Well, that was interesting, Sir Ibarra said. Wasn't it? Lugo smiled slightly. Was a good way to waste a half hour. Captain Carlos frowned at the receding nobleman's back, but, aside from that, it seemed pointless. Lugo scanned the Royal Army's formations, but he couldn't make out any individual details. They were arrayed to prevent the Dancing Duchess from landing any troops, which spoke volumes of how little of a threat they perceived Lugo's forces to be. Once he committed the Royal Army's positions and company composition to memory, he wheeled his mount back around and they returned to their lines at a leisurely pace. Lord Ilano made a demand, he said, but provided no justification for it. He wouldn't have hesitated to do so if the Royal Army was here to explicitly deal with us. In other words, Sir Ibarra said, he was trying to bluff us into giving up. He probably expected us to withdraw in the face of his show of force. Lugo nodded. I can imagine him easily convincing the army to array themselves against an unknown threat. Speaking of which, did he claim we only had 3 companies, or was I hearing things? Ah, Captain Carlos said, that's because they can only see 3 companies. What? Can you see 'em? With a furrow on his brow, Lugo sent his gaze to the gentle slopes along the shore. The lighting should have been good enough to clearly show their entire force, but he could only see the infantry at the core of the formation. His hand went to the spyglass in his right saddlebag, but he still couldn't spot any of Carlos' ranchers even with the device's assistance. What in the world? Captain Carlos' only response was an irreverent smirk. It was only when they nearly reached their lines that some of the ranchers reappeared. They hadn't moved at all from where they had been placed in the wings. Sir Ibarra, Lugo said, have you ever seen the like? I can't say I have, Lord Lugo. Ranchers were something like light cavalry, and light cavalry was often employed as a fast scouting force, but he had never heard of the notion being conveyed so literally. Captain Guerrero came forward to meet them a few dozen meters from the front of the infantry line. So, he said, what's the order? It was more and less complicated than we thought, Lugo replied. The Royalists refused to give any justification for the Royal Army's presence. Why? Because they can't, Sir Ibarra told him. They've gone as far as they can without knowingly doing anything illegal. They're not here for us? Lugo shook his head. They would have said so if they were. My guess is that they were on the way to the wall as per our original speculation. It was us breaking camp to rush after them that caused them to stop at Lloyd's. From there, the Royalists in the city probably fed their suspicions to the point where they were willing to get in our way. Where does that leave us? Captain Guerrero asked. I have no issues with dispatching Royalist forces, but now they're using ignorant soldiers against us. Wasting our time and resources dealing with that only works to our true enemy's advantage. It's yet another layer of the Royalists' strategy, Lugo said. They know that as well as we do. Even if they can't get the army to fight, they can still effectively keep us in check with it. If we advance, the army will respond with force due to their preconceptions. Captain Guerrero turned his head to look up the coast. 2 kilometers away, the walls of Lloyd's rose above the countryside. Beyond them, the galleons could be seen maneuvering in the port, and soldiers continued to march in a long column out of the gate. The more I think about it, the captain said, the more it seems they're the ones buying time, not us. Lugo didn't disagree. Lord Ilano's claim about his side's numbers may have been accurate, but so many men still took time to disembark. Either way, he said, we have a third player on the field, the Royal Army. Both rationally and legally speaking, they have no cause to attack us unless we provoke them. Additionally, they shouldn't be able to stay for long. Soldiers need to eat and, going by their numbers, those ships should only have supplies to last them the trip to the wall. So, Captain Carlos said, if we leave, they leave? That should be the case, Lugo nodded. The Dancing Duchess could meet us back at North Point to drop off our reinforcements. It seemed like the least volatile option. They could return once the army left and the Royalists would no longer be so confident about stopping them. Then, the Holy Order could carry out its investigation without interference, present its findings to the royal court, and Lloyd's prefecture would fully return under the previous management. Dozens of conservative scions assigned to Lloyd's prefecture were still shocked and hurt over being dismissed from their posts, and the reversal would vindicate them entirely. But what will the Royalists do while we wait for the army to leave? Captain Guerrero said. They know we're here and they also know we're coming after them. I don't see what they can do, Sir Ibarra said. 1 or 2 days won't erase the results of their actions. Their time is coming and they can do nothing about it. Lugo eyed the distant city again, trying to think of anything they might have overlooked. The problem was that the Royalists had been doing unthinkable things since the end of the war. Things have been so irregular that we can't make that assumption, Lugo said. But every other option available poses a much higher risk of turning this beach red with the blood of our people. Back to eating crab, I suppose, Captain Guerrero said. You may want to hold on to that thought, Captain Carlos pointed to the sea. A single white sail appeared from the direction of Lloyd's, heading along the coast in their direction. What appeared to be a fishing boat sailed quietly to the Dancing Duchess and disappeared behind the much larger vessel. It reappeared again 15 minutes later, this time on a course to the beach. It's Miss Baraja, Captain Carlos said. Lugo raised his spyglass. Sure enough, the faceless one was standing on the bow of the ship beside her bard. The only others present were some of the crew members of the vessel she had hired from Bast. I still don't get how he can see that far. Baraja's boat took a roundabout route to the shore, but the Royal Army didn't move. Not that they would break formation for a single fishing boat with a few passengers. Should we send an escort to retrieve her? Captain Guerrero asked. Not unless the Royalists dispatch riders to intercept, Lugo answered. They probably wouldn't, as sending anyone would place them at risk of being cut off from their allies by Lugo's forces. The Royal Army's broadly defensive mindset wouldn't tolerate that possibility, and the Royalists wouldn't be caught dead looking like they were scared enough of a fishing boat to send knights after it. As expected, Baraja disembarked without challenge and made her way over to them. She patted down her wind-tossed hair, which didn't seem to improve anything, just before she stopped to speak. It looks like everyone made it, she said. Indeed, Miss Baraja, Lugo replied. We were just discussing our options. Oh? The Royal Army shouldn't remain here for long before they continue their journey to the wall, Lugo told her. We were going to withdraw to North Point and return once they left. It won't work, Baraja said. Lugo frowned down at the woman. Explain. Every officer in that army is a royalist, Baraja told him. They won't leave. Baraja's 2 captains turned to look at Lugo. Is something wrong? Baraja asked. Nothing, Captain Carlos answered. It just feels like our theory about what's actually going on changes about every 3 hours. What about our original plan? Lugo asked. Were you able to present your offer to the Holy Order? I was in the middle of doing that when the Royalist galleons arrived in port. The nobles in the city paralyzed the Holy Order in a judicial quagmire. Lugo released a long sigh, eyeing the Royalist lines balefully. The good thing about having robust judicial oversight was that large-scale corruption was very difficult to pull off. The downside was that same strength could become a weakness that bogged things down. That doesn't mean their practical concerns simply vanish, Sir Ibarra said. Keeping thousands of men here indefinitely also means provisioning them indefinitely. Yes, and that just makes it worse, Baraja replied. The harvest that's supposed to feed Lloyd's will be intercepted by the work camps and rerouted to the army. The knight snorted at her assertion. I don't see how they can justify that. It only needs to be justified internally, Baraha said. The Royalists in Lloyds are in league with the Royalist army officers here, so the outcome simply becomes an abstract expense reported to Hobans. A number with no explanation beyond being an operational necessity. That's nobles, or at least the nobles that Lugo associated with, were thoroughly trained to be sensitive against that sort of abstraction and to investigate any suspect instances thoroughly to ensure the integrity of a fief's operations. It was a boring, but necessary, part of their duties. He never imagined that the Royalists would do the exact opposite and betray the trust of their tenants, vassals, and liege on such a grand scale. Or was it because they never treated their assignments in the north as the same duty in the first place? In any case, the situation had become even more untenable. That's certainly something we can't allow to happen, Lugo said. But the usual procedure would be to report the breach of trust, and those procedures are even now being tied up. If we force the issue, the Royalists will likely respond with force so long as they believe in our numerical advantage. About that, Baraha looked down at the grass. I think I can speak to them. We did that just before you sailed out of Lloyds, Lugo told her. Their representative, Lord Ilano of House Orta, was only interested in delivering the Royalists' ultimatum. I don't mean speaking to the Royalists. I'm going to speak to the Royal Army. Since they came in on Royalist ships, they should be from territories managed by the Royalists. My words should get through to them. The Royal Army? Her proposition was puzzling. Everyone knew that soldiers wouldn't waver so long as their officers held firm. Did she mean to leverage her fame as a war hero to sway their loyalties? Or maybe she hoped that she had followers in the army's ranks who would side with her. Lugo was left with no further explanation as Baraha went to the left wing of their formation and borrowed a horse. She rode out onto the beach to address the Royalists alone, bracing a flag of parley against her right stirrup. The soldiers assigned to hold the conservative forces in check didn't visibly react to her appearance. Sons and daughters of Roblay. He blinked as Baraha's voice conveyed itself clearly from hundreds of meters away. Only the most experienced of the Royal Army's commanders and generals had battlefield voices that carried so far. I come to you as our country teeters on the precipice of the abyss. The Faceless One's voice was grim. Though the war is over and the demonic invaders defeated, a new evil has fallen upon our beloved home. It is an evil that is far worse than anything that has come before, for this evil is one being visited upon us by our very own people. Though the waves continued to crash upon the shore and the wind blew incessantly from the sea, the air seemed to stand still in the wake of her words. You know of what I speak, Baraha said softly. The burdens that only seem to grow heavier as time passes. The brighter days that never seem to come. The hope that turns to ashes as your families are ground to dust while struggling to survive. I've been there too. I was in the heart of it, ignorant of the truth, toiling away while trusting that doing my little part would help bring around the restoration of the Holy Kingdom. Trusting that everyone was working together to reclaim the lives we once had. But, now, I know better. For I know the truth. The shadow of injustice has fallen upon our homes. Our trust is being exploited to enrich the Royalists and strengthen the fist crushing the heart of our country. We have become less than numbers on a ledger, sacrificed to build a future that will plunge our country into darkness for generations to come. Worst of all, the injustice of indifference has gripped our lives. Our people now turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. We've become too busy to care, trapped in hopeless days of toil. Day by day, the soul of our society is being slowly sundered and we have drifted apart, become strangers to one another. Or worse, enemies. We are being purposely driven into weakness, the sinful weakness that renders us helpless against injustice. And this is intolerable. Baraha spread her arms wide to either side. Many have rejected the injustice of the Royalists. They have been fighting against it from the start, though you may not have been aware. The people behind me are but a tiny fraction of those who have decided that enough is enough. They understand that weakness is a sin and have cultivated the strength to uphold their justice. Now, we will bring all of our strength to bear to eradicate the injustice entrenching itself in our home. Sons and daughters of Roblay, the time has come for you to decide, will you walk with us on the path of justice, or will you forever be trapped in the cycle of sin? The Faceless One lowered her arms and wheeled her mantle around. When she returned to her place in front of the conservative lines, she raised a fist into the air. Justice for Santiago. Justice for Santiago. Lugo started as hundreds of voices instantly roared in reply. Justice for the North. Justice for the North. Justice for the Holy Kingdom. Justice for the Holy Kingdom. Advance. Wait, what? The entire conservative force marched forward, and Lugo's companies had little choice but to comply or risk breaking the formation. Sir Ibarra sent a confused look in his direction and Lugo shifted his mount closer to Baraha. What are you doing? I'm doing what must be done, Lord Lugo, the Faceless One replied. You didn't say anything about attacking them like this. It's probably not as bad as you think, Say said from across Baraha. This is already the worst-case scenario, how is it anything but bad? Ahead of him, the Royal Army's lines drew closer. There were only 500 meters between them, so the soldiers positioned to block a landing force from the Dancing Duchess were rushing to reform their lines against the rapidly closing conservative formation. Shouts from the army's officers sounded through the air as they struggled to maintain order in the ranks. All right, I'll give her that, but this is still going to be a bloodbath. Wait, what in the gods' names is going on? At 400 meters, the chaos in the Royal Army's lines was evident. At 300 meters, gaping holes started to open in the formation as a flood of soldiers fled back toward Lloyd's. The army officers were still shouting their orders, but their efforts were plainly in vain. Hold. Baraha's voice rang over the battlefield. Their ranks halted 200 meters from what remained of the army's lines. Shields already raised to receive their foe, the troops exchanged confused glances. Captain Guerrero. Yes, ma'am? What's left should be royalists, right? Yes, ma'am. I see, the woman took a deep breath and sighed. It's too bad it's come to this. The Faceless One nodded to the captain. The captain raised his hand. Draw. Draw. Captain Carlos and a score of sergeants repeated the order down the line. Hundreds of bows and crossbows were raised against the royalist lines. Lugo gripped his reins, knowing he could do nothing to stop them. Is this right? How can they harbor so much conviction that they're willing to slaughter their own people? Loose. A storm of quarrels and arrows arced through the air, their bodkin points glinting in the moonlight. Lugo's cheek twitched as the hail of iron scythed into the troops. Not even masterwork breastplates fashioned from tempered steel seemed to matter as armsman and knight alike fell under the onslaught. Draw. Captain Guerrero commanded. That's good enough, Captain, Baraha said. Stand down. In front of them, the royalist forces were already decimated. Lugo wasn't sure how, but it seemed that Baraha's men had successfully targeted the royalist officers even at their distance. What remained of the enemy ranks were already joining the flight to the gate. Captain Carlos, Baraha said, cast a net. Interdict the entire area around Lloyd's. Track down anyone that's escaped ahead of you. You got it. Lord Lugo. I believe your men are better suited than mine at processing captives. Lugo nodded. It shouldn't be a problem. Ibarra, see to the royalist survivors. Yes, Lord Lugo. He returned his gaze to Baraha. The woman looked more weary than anything else. If you're trying to prevent word of the battle from spreading, he told her, you'll have to take care of those galleons, as well. Ah, about that, Baraha said. They're already being taken care of. Confused, Lugo looked over at the city harbor. To his surprise, the Dancing Duchess was alongside one of the royalist galleons and rowboats littered the water. Is that why you stopped by our ship first? The royalist soldiers were mostly out here facing us, the Faceless One replied. It seemed like a good idea to take their ships while they were away. Lugo snorted and shook his head. Tales from far-off lands always seemed to glorify taking the initiative, but, to the people of the Holy Kingdom, doing so seemed all but suicidal. Maybe there was some truth to the notion. A great cheer arose from the walls of Lloyd's when they approached the city gate at dawn. Outside of the walls, the work camps were surrounded by citizens armed with makeshift weaponry and it looked like the deserter soldiers were helping them out. Upon entering the city, Lugo looked around silently at the scenes surrounding him. Somehow, things were running in good order despite no notable attempts at overall coordination. I expected just a bit more chaos, Lugo said. I guess my words reached them, after all, Baraha said. You spoke to them while you were in the city? Some of them, but what I meant was that what I said back on the beach was heard in the city. Say said I should try to reach as far as possible with my voice, so I did. What did that even mean? Reaching the soldiers on both sides of the beach was an impressive feat, but being heard in a city 2 kilometers away was impossible. The word fell out of Lugo's mouth. Hey, Say stopped to talk to some people on the side of the street. Did you hear a speech just now? I did, one of the spectators nodded. We all did. You've come to restore justice to the Holy Kingdom, right? Impossible. It was something that one might find in a strange fantasy world, not reality. They made their way to the city harbor amidst the cheers and well wishes of the city folk. There, a blonde-haired man with a dusky tan approached them and offered a salute. Miss Baraha, he said. We pulled it off. Did anyone escape? Baraha asked. No, ma'am. Out on the water, the Royalist and Royal Army ensigns had already been removed and 4 of the galleons were anchored in a line blocking the harbor. Lugo scanned the wharf for captives, but it looked like they had been stowed away elsewhere. Now that you've come so far, Lugo asked, what do you plan on doing? He feared to hear what Duke de Bonai had to say about everything that had happened. The worst part about it all was how powerless Lugo had been as the representative of the conservative faction. This is what everyone wants, isn't it? Baraha said, justice for the Holy Kingdom. The Faceless One's address and declaration echoed through his mind. He was beginning to think that her definition of justice was a very different one from his.